The fires that consumed the temples of Athens were not an accident of war. They were ordered, calculated, and meant to be remembered. What burned on that hill was more than stone. It was a message carved into ash. By the time Xerxes I turned his attention toward the Greek mainland, the conflict between the Achaemenid Empire and the fractious city-states of Greece had already hardened into something irreversible. This was no longer a campaign of expansion alone. It had become a contest of memory, humiliation, and retaliation that stretched back decades, rooted in events that neither side had forgotten. The origins of that tension lay in the earlier reign of Darius I, Xerxes' father. When the Ionian Greek cities along the western coast of Asia Minor revolted against Persian rule at the end of the 6th century BCE, they did not act alone. Support came from mainland Greece, particularly from Athens, which sent ships and men to assist the rebellion. This intervention culminated in the burning of Sardis, one of the key administrative centers of Persian authority in the region. The destruction of Sardis was not total, but its symbolic weight was immense. For the Persian court, this was not a minor disturbance. It was a direct insult, an attack not only on imperial territory, but on the authority of the great king himself. According to later Greek accounts, Darius ordered a servant to remind him daily of the Athenians, a ritualized fixation that suggests how deeply the event had embedded itself into imperial consciousness. When Darius launched his punitive expedition against Greece, it ended in failure at the Battle of Marathon. The defeat was not catastrophic in terms of manpower, but its psychological effect was profound. A small coalition of Greek forces had repelled what was meant to be a demonstration of overwhelming imperial power. The message that Persia intended to send had been inverted. By the time Xerxes inherited the throne in 486 BCE, he inherited more than an empire. He inherited an unfinished act of retribution. His early reign was marked by the need to stabilize revolts within the empire, particularly in Egypt and Babylon. But the question of Greece remained unresolved. The memory of Sardis, compounded by Marathon, created a narrative that demanded correction. The invasion that Xerxes eventually organized was not improvised. It was deliberate in scale and intention. Massive logistical preparations were undertaken. Bridges constructed across the Hellespont, canals cut through the isthmus of Mount Athos, supply lines extended across vast distances. This was not merely a campaign to subdue rebellious territories. It was an assertion of imperial inevitability. When Persian forces advanced into Greece, they encountered resistance that was fragmented but determined. The stand at Thermopylae, led by Leonidas I, delayed but did not halt the Persian advance. The Greek fleet, meanwhile, engaged in a series of naval maneuvers that prevented total encirclement, but could not decisively stop the Persian momentum. Athens itself faced a strategic dilemma. Its strength lay in its navy, not in its ability to withstand a prolonged land siege. Under the guidance of leaders such as Themistocles, the population was evacuated. Civilians were relocated to nearby islands, particularly Salamis, while the city was effectively abandoned. When Xerxes entered Athens in 480 BCE, he did not encounter a living city. He encountered an absence. But what remained was not insignificant. The Acropolis of Athens still stood, crowned with temples that carried deep religious and cultural significance. Among them were early sanctuaries dedicated to Athena, protector of the city. It is here that the nature of Xerxes' decision becomes clear. The destruction of these sacred sites was not militarily necessary. There was no defensive advantage gained by burning temples. The Athenians had already withdrawn. There was no immediate tactical threat emanating from the Acropolis. What remained was symbolism. In ordering the destruction of the temples, Xerxes was not acting impulsively. He was acting within a framework of imperial logic that understood the power of visible, irreversible acts. The burning of Sardis decades earlier had carried symbolic meaning for the Greeks. Now, the destruction of Athens' Sacred Heart would serve as a reciprocal statement. Ancient warfare often involved the targeting of sanctuaries, but such actions were not taken lightly. Religious sites were typically afforded a degree of respect, even among enemies, because they existed within a shared understanding of divine presence. To violate that space was to send a message that transcended ordinary conflict. By destroying the temples on the Acropolis, Xerxes communicated several things simultaneously. He demonstrated that Persian authority could reach into the most sacred spaces of its enemies. He erased, however temporarily, the visible markers of Athenian identity, and he enacted a form of punishment that was meant to resonate beyond the immediate moment. The act also functioned as a psychological instrument. For the displaced Athenians, witnessing or later learning of the destruction would have reinforced the reality of their vulnerability. Their city was not merely occupied, it had been desecrated. The protective presence of their gods, embodied in temples and statues, had been violated. At the same time, the destruction served a broader imperial audience. Within the Persian Empire, news of such actions would reinforce the image of the king as an enforcer of order and avenger of past wrongs. The message was not limited to Greece. It extended to all regions under Persian control, where the consequences of defiance were being demonstrated in unmistakable terms. Yet the decision also carried risks. The violation of sacred spaces could harden resistance rather than suppress it. For the Greeks, whose religious and civic identities were deeply intertwined, the destruction of the Acropolis was not merely a loss. It was an affront that demanded response. As the smoke rose over Athens, the conflict entered a new phase. What had begun as a campaign of retribution was evolving into something more complex, shaped by cycles of destruction and reaction that neither side could fully control. The flames on the Acropolis did not end the war. They intensified it, and in doing so, they set the stage for consequences that Xerxes could not entirely predict. The destruction of a sacred hill did not bring submission. It hardened resolve. What Xerxes had intended as a demonstration of finality instead became a catalyst. The war was no longer about control. It had become about survival and vengeance. In the immediate aftermath of the burning of the Acropolis of Athens, the strategic situation remained fluid, not settled. Xerxes had achieved a symbolic victory, but Greece itself was not conquered. The core of Athenian power had never been its walls. It was its fleet, now concentrated offshore, waiting. The evacuation orchestrated under Themistocles had preserved the essential strength of Athens. Its people, its sailors, and its warships remained intact. What had been sacrificed was the physical city. What endured was the mechanism of resistance. From a Persian perspective, this created a problem that could not be solved through occupation alone. Xerxes had advanced with overwhelming force, yet the enemy had refused to present a decisive land battle after Battle of Thermopylae. Instead, they had withdrawn into a maritime strategy that threatened Persian supply lines and mobility. The geography of Greece amplified this challenge. Narrow straits, unpredictable winds, and confined waterways limited the effectiveness of the vast Persian fleet. Numerical superiority, which had been decisive in open terrain, became less reliable in restricted conditions. The Greeks understood this. Themistocles, in particular, recognized that the war could not be won by matching Persia's scale. It had to be reshaped. The island of Salamis became the focal point of that reshaping. There, the Greek fleet gathered, not as a unified nation, but as a fragile coalition of city-states with competing interests. Sparta, Corinth, Aegina, and others all contributed ships, yet their strategic priorities were not identical. Some favored retreat. Others argued for engagement. This internal division was not lost on Xerxes. From his vantage point, the Greeks appeared fractured, uncertain, and vulnerable. The destruction of Athens seemed to confirm that their resistance was collapsing. It is within this context that his earlier decision to burn the temples takes on additional significance. It was not only a retaliatory act, but also a calculation that psychological pressure might accelerate disunity among the Greeks. Yet that calculation underestimated the effect of sacrilege on collective identity. The destruction of sacred sites did not fragment the Greeks further. It provided a unifying grievance. Even rival city-states could recognize the implications of what had been done. If Athens could be desecrated, no sanctuary was secure. Meanwhile, Xerxes faced his own constraints. Maintaining a massive army and fleet far from the imperial center required continuous logistical support. Supplies had to be transported across long distances, vulnerable to disruption. Time, which initially favored the invader, began to introduce complications. A prolonged campaign increased the risk of attrition, disease, and instability within the ranks. The decision before Xerxes was therefore not simply whether to continue the advance. It was how to force a decisive conclusion. The Greek fleet at Salamis represented both a threat and an opportunity. If destroyed, it would eliminate the primary means of organized resistance. If allowed to remain intact, it would continue to undermine Persian control of the region. Themistocles understood this dynamic with precision. His strategy was not merely defensive. It was manipulative. By sending misleading signals to Xerxes, suggesting that the Greek coalition was on the verge of collapse and retreat, he aimed to draw the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis, where their numerical advantage would be constrained. Xerxes accepted the bait. The resulting engagement, known as the Battle of Salamis, was shaped by the very factors that had defined the preceding phase of the war. The confined waters negated the scale of the Persian fleet. Coordination became difficult. Ships crowded into limited space, reducing maneuverability. In contrast, the Greek vessels, smaller and more agile, operated with greater cohesion. From a strategic standpoint, the battle marked a turning point. The Persian fleet, though not annihilated, suffered significant losses. More importantly, its aura of invincibility was broken. Xerxes, who had personally observed the battle from a vantage point overlooking the straits, witnessed a reversal that contradicted the expectations established by his earlier successes. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be separated from the events at Athens. The burning of the Acropolis had been intended to project dominance. The defeat at Salamis exposed the limits of that projection. The message that had been sent in flames was now countered by a demonstration of vulnerability. For the Greeks, the victory carried layered significance. It was not only a military success, but also a form of symbolic rebalancing. The destruction of their sacred sites had not gone unanswered. Though the temples themselves remained in ruins, the capacity to resist and to inflict damage had been reaffirmed. Xerxes' response to the outcome at Salamis was measured, not impulsive. Recognizing the risks of continuing the campaign under altered conditions, he chose to withdraw a substantial portion of his forces. This decision has often been interpreted as a retreat, but within the logic of imperial strategy, it was a recalibration. The objective shifted from total conquest to the preservation of strength. He left behind a significant contingent under the command of Mardonius, tasked with continuing operations in Greece. This was not an abandonment of the campaign, but a modification of its scale. The war was not over. It had entered a new phase, one in which the consequences of earlier decisions, including the destruction of Athens, would continue to unfold. The ruins of the Acropolis remained as a physical testament to what had occurred. They were not immediately rebuilt. Instead, they stood as a deliberate reminder, both for the Athenians and for their allies, of the cost of the conflict. The memory of the burned temples became integrated into the narrative of resistance, shaping how subsequent events were interpreted. At the same time, the Persian presence in central Greece ensured that the conflict retained its intensity. Mardonius sought to exploit divisions among the Greek city-states, offering terms to Athens that included reconstruction and autonomy in exchange for submission. These offers were not purely conciliatory. They were strategic attempts to dismantle the coalition from within. Athens refused. That refusal cannot be fully understood without considering the impact of what had been lost. The destruction of their sacred spaces had transformed the stakes. Submission would not merely mean political subordination. It would require accepting the desecration as final without response. The war, therefore, continued with a sharpened edge. Each subsequent movement, each negotiation, Each battle was influenced by the memory of fire on the Acropolis. Xerxes' decision had achieved its immediate effect, but it had also ensured that the conflict would not end quickly or quietly. The withdrawal of Xerxes did not end the invasion. It changed its shape. Power no longer moved as a single overwhelming force, but as a divided occupation across hostile terrain. And in that division, the consequences of burned sanctuaries began to harden into strategy. The remaining Persian command in Greece, led by Mardonius, inherited a campaign that had lost its initial psychological momentum. The emperor had departed, but the imperial army remained, stationed across central Greek territory in a state that was neither conquest nor retreat. It was suspension. In the wake of the naval defeat at the Battle of Salamis, the operational logic of the invasion had fractured. The Persian fleet, once intended to dominate the Aegean, was no longer capable of enforcing maritime control. The land army still possessed strength, but it now operated without full coordination with naval support. This separation altered every calculation that followed. The political landscape of Greece, meanwhile, did not stabilize into submission. Instead, it reorganized around resistance. Athens, though physically ruined after the burning of its sacred center at the Acropolis of Athens, became the symbolic anchor of continued opposition. Its population remained displaced, but its political identity remained intact. The refusal of Athens to accept Persian terms offered by Mardonius was not simply ideological. It was shaped by memory. The destruction of temples had created a boundary that could not easily be crossed. Negotiation implied acceptance of irreversible loss. For many Athenians, that loss could not be normalized. Across Greece, however, unity remained fragile. The coalition that had formed at Salamis was still a coalition, not a unified state. City-states maintained competing priorities. Some, particularly those closer to Persian supply routes, considered accommodation. Others, especially those with strong maritime interests, saw continued resistance as the only viable path. This instability was precisely what Mardonius attempted to exploit. His strategy shifted from direct confrontation to political fragmentation. He understood that the Persian position in Greece depended not only on military strength, but on the erosion of collective resistance. If the alliance fractured, the remaining Greek forces could be isolated and neutralized individually. At the same time, the physical presence of Persian forces in central Greece maintained pressure. The occupation was not static. It moved through requisition, negotiation, and localized military engagement. Yet it lacked the decisive force that had characterized the initial invasion. The destruction of Athens had demonstrated what Persian power could do at its peak, but had not produced permanent control. In Athens itself, the psychological aftermath of the burned sanctuaries continued to shape decision-making. The ruins of the Acropolis were more than destroyed architecture. They functioned as a constant reminder of vulnerability. Yet paradoxically, that vulnerability strengthened resolve. The absence of temples became an argument for resistance rather than submission. The political leadership within Athens, though dispersed due to evacuation, continued to operate through naval coordination. The fleet, which had survived intact, remained central to Greek strategic planning. Without it, Athens would have been politically irrelevant. With it, it remained decisive. Mardonius recognized this. His attempts to break the Greek coalition focused heavily on separating Athens from its allies. He offered reconstruction, autonomy, and favorable terms. These proposals were designed not only to win compliance, but to isolate Sparta and other resistant states by removing Athens from the alliance structure. The offers included the promise of rebuilding the destroyed sacred spaces. This was not incidental. It directly addressed the psychological wound left by Xerxes' earlier decision. Restoration of temples would have symbolized closure. But closure on Persian terms implied acknowledgement of Persian authority. Athens rejected these proposals again. The refusal reflected a deeper transformation in Greek political consciousness. The destruction of religious sites had blurred the line between political sovereignty and cultural identity. Accepting reconstruction under foreign authority would have meant redefining both. While diplomacy unfolded, military positioning continued to evolve. The Persian army established fortified positions in Boeotia, leveraging open terrain to maintain supply access. Greek forces, meanwhile, consolidated near defensible positions, preparing for a decisive engagement that both sides understood was approaching. The tension between the two armies was not merely tactical. It was cumulative. Each prior event, the burning of Athens, the naval defeat at Salamis, the withdrawal of Xerxes, had contributed to a situation in which neither side could easily disengage without consequence. For Mardonius, victory required breaking Greek cohesion before it could translate into coordinated battlefield strength. For the Greeks, survival depended on forcing a confrontation under conditions that neutralized Persian advantages. The resulting convergence occurred near Plataea. The terrain, open yet structured by natural constraints, would become the stage for one of the decisive land engagements of the conflict. But before that battle unfolded, the strategic environment had already been shaped by earlier acts of destruction. The burned temples of Athens were not physically present on that field, yet they influenced every decision made there. They had altered the psychological framework within which both sides understood risk, retaliation, and legitimacy. The Persian army entered the final phase of the campaign with significant resources, but without the unified momentum that had characterized its advance under Xerxes. The Greek forces entered fragmented but increasingly committed. The destruction of their sacred center had removed the possibility of partial reconciliation. What remained was confrontation. And in that confrontation, the consequences of Xerxes' earlier decision would reach their next stage of resolution. The confrontation at Plataea was not the sudden climax of a single campaign. It was the accumulation of a sequence of decisions, withdrawals, and irreversible acts of destruction. Each phase of the war had narrowed the possibilities until only one outcome remained possible: a decisive land engagement. And by this point, the memory of burned sanctuaries in Athens had already hardened into strategic certainty on both sides. The Persian force under Mardonius had established itself in the plains of Plataea, selecting terrain that allowed for cavalry maneuverability and logistical stability. It was a calculated position. Open ground favored Persian military doctrine, particularly the mobility of its mounted units and the flexibility of its larger formations. Opposing them were the combined Greek forces, a coalition still marked by internal tension, but now bound by necessity. The evacuation and destruction of Athens, including the burning of its sacred core at the Acropolis of Athens, had eliminated any remaining illusion that partial compromise would restore the previous order. The war had become existential in a way that earlier phases had not fully reached. Within the Greek coalition, leadership dynamics remained complex. Spartan command dominated land operations, while Athenian forces, still under the strategic influence of Themistocles' earlier maritime planning, provided naval security and logistical mobility. Yet the emotional center of resistance was no longer purely strategic. It was shaped by accumulated injury. The Persian position at Plataea was strong in appearance, but increasingly strained in structure. Supply lines stretched across hostile or semi-hostile territory. Communication between contingents was inconsistent. And most importantly, the psychological unity that had characterized the early stages of Xerxes' invasion had fractured after his withdrawal following the Battle of Salamis. Mardonius attempted to maintain cohesion through controlled engagement strategies. Rather than forcing immediate confrontation, he maneuvered to draw the Greeks into unfavorable terrain or to divide their forces. His objective was not simply battlefield victory, but structural collapse of the coalition. The Greeks, however, had learned from earlier phases of the war. The destruction of Athens had demonstrated that Persian strategy could combine overwhelming force with symbolic violence. But it had also revealed limits. Even after the burning of temples and occupation of territory, resistance had not ceased. Instead, it had reorganized. This reorganization became evident in the Greek refusal to be drawn into disordered engagement. They held defensive positions, maintained supply discipline, and avoided premature fragmentation. The coalition, though not fully unified, had developed a shared understanding. The Persian army could not be defeated through isolated action. The tension at Plataea extended over days. Neither side immediately committed to full engagement. Instead, the battlefield became a space of movement, repositioning, and psychological pressure. Skirmishes occurred at the edges, probing attacks tested formations, and supply disruptions created uncertainty. During this period, the memory of Athens remained a silent but constant factor. The burned Acropolis was not physically present, yet its absence shaped Greek determination. It had become a reference point for what failure meant. Not simply defeat in battle, but the erasure of civic and religious continuity. For Persian forces, the same memory functioned differently. The destruction of Athens had been intended as a demonstration of imperial reach and authority. But as the campaign continued, it became one of several contested symbols. Instead of producing submission, it had become part of a cycle that intensified resistance. Logistical strain began to affect Persian operations more visibly as the standoff continued. The longer the army remained in central Greece, the more dependent it became on contested supply routes. Local resistance and disruption reduced the reliability of provisioning. This did not immediately weaken combat capability, but it increased strategic pressure on command decisions. Mardonius remained committed to seeking a favorable engagement rather than withdrawing. Retreat at this stage would not simply be a tactical repositioning. It would carry political implications across the empire, signaling limits to Persian control in the western frontier. On the Greek side, decision-making was influenced by caution rather than aggression. The coalition understood that direct engagement with Persian cavalry and numerically superior forces carried significant risk. But prolonged avoidance also carried risk of attrition and fragmentation. The battlefield thus became a space of controlled tension, where both sides attempted to force the other into a mistake. The Greeks relied on cohesion and defensive positioning. The Persians relied on mobility and psychological pressure. At this stage, the war had fully transitioned from its initial phase of imperial expansion into a contest defined by endurance and adaptation. The burning of Athens had marked the point at which symbolic warfare merged with strategic necessity. After that moment, every decision carried both immediate and long-term consequences. The confrontation at Plataea would eventually resolve this tension, but not before it exposed the limits of both approaches. Persian operational strength would meet the constraints of extended supply and coalition resistance. Greek cohesion would be tested against the reality of open field engagement with a larger and more mobile force. And beneath all of it, the earlier decision to destroy sacred structures in Athens remained embedded in the logic of the conflict. It had not ended the war. It had reshaped its emotional and strategic architecture. As the armies continued their cautious maneuvering, the conditions for decisive engagement were quietly forming. And neither side could fully step away from what had already been set in motion. By the time the armies at Plataea began to close distance in earnest, the war had already exceeded the original purpose of punishment and deterrence. What remained was not an invasion in the traditional sense, but a collapsing equilibrium between occupation, resistance, and exhaustive logistics. Every movement now carried the weight of irreversible earlier decisions, especially the destruction of Athens' sacred core. The Persian command under Mardonius still held numerical strength, but that strength was increasingly dependent on coherence. The army was not a single unified instrument. It was a coalition of imperial contingents drawn from different regions of the Achaemenid Empire, each with its own logistical dependencies and command structures. Such diversity had been an advantage in expansion, but in prolonged campaigning, it created friction. The terrain of Plataea offered neither side complete advantage. For the Persians, it provided space for cavalry deployment. For the Greeks, it provided defensible terrain with access to supply routes anchored by allied cities. But terrain alone could not resolve the deeper structural imbalance of a war that had extended beyond its initial design. The Greek coalition, still formally united, operated under a different kind of pressure. Its cohesion was not institutional, but psychological. The shared memory of Athens, particularly the destruction of its sacred landscape at the Acropolis of Athens, functioned as a binding force. It replaced political unity with emotional necessity. Within this coalition, the influence of Themistocles remained indirect but significant. His earlier naval strategy had preserved the Athenian state's operational capacity even after the evacuation. That decision ensured that Athens could continue to contribute meaningfully to the broader Greek war effort, even without its physical city intact. The Persian leadership, by contrast, was constrained by the absence of its supreme commander. Since the withdrawal of Xerxes I after the naval defeat at the Battle of Salamis, authority in Greece had been delegated to Mardonius. This decentralization placed full responsibility for the campaign's outcome on a single general operating far from imperial oversight. As the standoff intensified, both sides engaged in controlled repositioning rather than direct assault. This phase of the conflict was defined by hesitation masked as strategy. Each army sought to provoke imbalance in the other without committing prematurely to a full-scale engagement that could be decisive in either direction. The Greeks maintained disciplined defensive formations. Their infantry, particularly the heavily armored hoplites, relied on cohesion and terrain awareness. Their strategy was not to outmaneuver Persian forces in open mobility, but to force engagement under conditions that reduced Persian cavalry effectiveness. The Persians, aware of this, attempted to disrupt Greek supply lines and provoke movement. Cavalry raids and probing attacks targeted logistical routes, aiming to induce fragmentation within the Greek coalition. These tactics were consistent with earlier phases of the campaign, where pressure rather than direct confrontation had often been the preferred method. Yet the effectiveness of these tactics was diminishing. The Greeks had adapted. They no longer reacted immediately to provocation. Instead, they absorbed pressure, maintaining formation discipline even under sustained disruption. This adaptation reflected the cumulative learning of the entire war. The memory of Athens' destruction played an indirect but persistent role in this discipline. The burned sanctuaries were not merely symbolic losses. They represented a point beyond which compromise no longer carried restoration. This psychological threshold altered Greek strategic behavior. Retreat or fragmentation now carried implications that extended beyond military defeat. For Mardonius, this rigidity in Greek behavior posed a strategic problem. The expectation that pressure would induce division was not materializing at the expected rate. Instead, the coalition was stabilizing under stress. This meant that a decisive outcome would require direct engagement rather than indirect destabilization. The decision to move toward confrontation was not immediate. It emerged gradually from accumulated operational constraints. Supply pressure, limited time, and the inability to break Greek cohesion through maneuver all converged toward a narrowing set of options. At the same time, internal dynamics within the Persian forces began to reflect strain. Communication delays between contingents, differences in command interpretation, and the extended duration of the campaign created inefficiencies. These were not dramatic failures, but incremental degradations that affected timing and coordination. The Greeks, while more cohesive in motivation, faced their own constraints. Extended mobilization placed pressure on resources and coordination among city-states. Yet the existence of a shared existential reference point, the destruction of Athens, helped maintain alignment where political structures alone might not have sufficed. The battlefield itself became increasingly static. Neither side committed to full-scale movement, but neither disengaged. This produced a form of strategic compression, where the range of possible outcomes narrowed over time without immediate resolution. Within this compressed environment, small actions carried disproportionate weight. A repositioned unit, a disrupted supply line, or a delayed communication could alter perceptions of vulnerability. Both sides monitored these micro-shifts closely, aware that large-scale movement would likely determine the outcome of the campaign. The war had reached a stage where inertia itself was unstable. Remaining in position carried risks. Moving carried risks. Even delay carried risks. The system was approaching a point where equilibrium could no longer be maintained. And beneath all of this, the earlier act that had transformed Athens from a functioning city into a symbol of destruction remained embedded in the logic of the conflict. It had altered not only what had been lost, but what each side believed could still be regained. As the armies prepared for what would soon become decisive engagement, the war entered its final structural phase of tension, and the space between decision and action began to close. The standoff at Plataea did not break through a single dramatic command. It fractured through pressure, miscalculation, and the slow erosion of supply stability. What appeared as hesitation on the surface was in reality a tightening chain of constraints that neither side could fully reverse. And at its center, the Persian field command under Mardonius was beginning to feel the limits of endurance more sharply than the Greeks. The Persian position near Plataea had been chosen for its tactical openness, but that same openness created exposure over time. Greek forces, commanded on land by Pausanias, avoided direct engagement while maintaining disciplined formation. The strategy was not aggression. It was containment through patience. What transformed this phase was not a sudden decision, but a disruption in supply access. Persian forces relied heavily on extended logistical lines running through contested territory. As those routes became increasingly unstable, the army's ability to remain in position without risk began to weaken. Water access, in particular, became a point of pressure as Greek forces sought to control nearby sources and channels feeding the Persian camp. This shift forced Mardonius to reconsider his positioning. Remaining static meant attrition. Moving meant exposure. The equilibrium that had defined the earlier phase of the standoff was collapsing into forced action. At the same time, the Greek coalition began a controlled repositioning. This was not retreat in the conventional sense, but a deliberate adjustment toward terrain that offered better supply access and defensive advantage. Yet such movements were complex because the coalition was not a single unified army. It was a coordination of multiple contingents, each with its own internal hierarchy and decision-making structure. Within the Spartan contingent, discipline was absolute, but not without internal tension. Certain commanders resisted synchronized movement, believing repositioning could be interpreted as weakness. One such figure, traditionally identified in historical accounts, was Ammopharitus, whose refusal to withdraw with the main Spartan line created localized fragmentation during the maneuver phase. These internal fractures did not break the army, but they revealed how fragile cohesion could become under stress. The Persian command observed these movements closely. From their perspective, Greek repositioning appeared as a potential withdrawal under pressure. This interpretation influenced Mardonius' decision-making. He saw opportunity in perceived disarray, even if that perception was only partial. At this stage, the memory of earlier destruction still lingered beneath strategic calculation. The burned sacred structures of Acropolis of Athens had already reshaped the psychological framework of the war. It had removed the possibility of partial reconciliation. But in this phase of the conflict, that memory functioned less as immediate motivation and more as structural background, a reminder that the war had already crossed thresholds that could not be reversed. As the Greek forces repositioned, Persian cavalry began to increase pressure on exposed segments of the movement. These were not full-scale engagements, but targeted strikes intended to disrupt coordination. The goal was to exploit the moment of transition, when armies are most vulnerable, not while stationary, but while reorganizing. Greek commanders responded by tightening formation discipline and accelerating movement into more defensible ground. This interplay of pressure and adjustment created a dynamic battlefield environment that shifted daily without producing decisive engagement. Meanwhile, communication delays within the Persian camp began to affect operational clarity. Orders did not always reach subordinate units simultaneously. Terrain, distance, and the complexity of the multi-ethnic force contributed to uneven execution. These inefficiencies did not collapse the army, but they reduced its ability to coordinate large-scale maneuvers with precision. Within the Greek coalition, coordination was also imperfect, but it was stabilized by a shared understanding of stakes. The destruction of Athens had become more than an event. It functioned as a reference point that reduced the tolerance for fragmentation. Even when disagreements emerged, they were contained within the larger necessity of survival. As the armies repositioned again, the Persian command interpreted Greek movement as a potential retreat toward more defensible terrain. This interpretation carried strategic temptation. If the Greeks were withdrawing, then a rapid pursuit could force a decisive engagement before they fully stabilized their new position. Mardonius began to prepare for this possibility. Cavalry units were repositioned for forward pressure. Infantry formations were adjusted for rapid deployment. The intent was not yet full engagement, but readiness for escalation if opportunity emerged. The Greeks, however, were not retreating in disorder. Their movement was structured, deliberate, and supported by reconnaissance of terrain. The objective was to shorten supply lines and reduce exposure to cavalry disruption. Yet because this movement involved multiple contingents, timing variations created temporary separation between units. It was within this narrow window of misalignment that the conditions for battle began to solidify. Neither side had fully committed, but both had entered configurations that reduced flexibility. The battlefield was no longer fluid in the open sense. It was narrowing toward contact. At the same time, environmental constraints began to play a role. Terrain channels, river proximity, and supply access points shaped where forces could safely remain. These constraints limited the range of viable movement options for both armies. Strategic choice was increasingly replaced by structural necessity. In Persian planning, this narrowing was interpreted as an opportunity to force engagement under favorable conditions. In Greek planning, it was understood as a transition into the final phase of confrontation. Both sides, though differently, recognized that the standoff could not continue indefinitely. The psychological atmosphere of the camps reflected this awareness. There was no singular moment of realization, but a gradual compression of expectation. Soldiers understood that the period of maneuver without decisive contact was ending. Every movement carried anticipation of contact, even when no engagement occurred. And beneath all of this, the earlier destruction of Athens remained embedded in the logic of resistance and retaliation. It did not dictate tactics directly at this stage, but it shaped the refusal to accept partial outcomes. The war could no longer end in symbolic gestures. It would end only through resolution. As Persian forces finalized preparations for pressure-based engagement and Greek forces completed their repositioning into more defensible alignment, the system reached a threshold where further delay would no longer stabilize the situation. The next shift would not be gradual. It would be structural, and it was already beginning to form. The final collapse of maneuver space around Plataea did not come from a single tactical error. It came from the exhaustion of options on both sides. What had begun as a prolonged standoff had now narrowed into forced proximity, where hesitation itself became a liability. And in that narrowing, the Persian command under Mardonius moved first. The decision was shaped by pressure rather than confidence. Supply instability, prolonged exposure near Plataea, and the inability to break Greek cohesion through maneuver had created a situation where continued delay offered no strategic advantage. The Persian army could not remain indefinitely in a static posture without risking internal degradation. Greek forces under Spartan command, led by Pausanias, had by this stage completed their repositioning into terrain that improved defensive stability and reduced cavalry effectiveness. This positioning was not aggressive, but it was deliberate. It anticipated the moment when Persian pressure would transition into direct engagement. The trigger for that transition was not a formal declaration. It was a sequence of escalating encounters. Persian cavalry units began probing attacks against Greek positions, testing for weak points in formation alignment. These were not full engagements, but structured disruptions designed to force reaction. The Greeks responded with restraint. Rather than breaking formation to counterattack, they absorbed pressure and maintained structural integrity. This discipline was critical. It prevented the fragmentation that Persian forces had sought since earlier phases of the campaign. At the same time, Persian command interpreted Greek restraint differently. From their perspective, the lack of immediate counteroffensive suggested vulnerability or hesitation. This interpretation encouraged escalation. Mardonius ordered increased pressure, believing that sustained aggression would eventually force collapse. The battlefield thus transitioned from standoff to active engagement through accumulation rather than sudden rupture. Skirmishes intensified. Cavalry exchanges became more frequent. Infantry formations adjusted repeatedly to maintain cohesion under pressure. Within the Persian camp, coordination began to strain under the speed of escalation. Units were deployed rapidly in response to perceived opportunities, but communication delays created uneven timing. Some contingents advanced without full synchronization, creating gaps in formation density. Greek forces exploited these gaps not through pursuit, but through structural stability. Their strategy remained consistent: hold formation, resist fragmentation, and allow Persian overextension to create vulnerability. As pressure increased, Mardonius committed his elite forces into more direct confrontation. This was a critical escalation point. The Persian army was no longer testing Greek positions. It was attempting to break them through sustained engagement. At this stage, the earlier destruction of Athens reemerged as a silent but defining influence. The burning of sacred structures at the Acropolis of Athens had removed any psychological pathway toward negotiated withdrawal for the Greeks. The conflict was no longer reversible through diplomacy or symbolic concession. It had become structurally terminal. Greek morale did not manifest as aggression, but as refusal to disintegrate. Units held position under increasing pressure, even as Persian forces intensified their attacks. The cohesion of the Greek line became its primary defensive mechanism. Meanwhile, Persian cavalry attempted to encircle segments of the Greek formation. This maneuver required precise coordination, but terrain constraints and communication delays reduced its effectiveness. Partial encirclements formed but did not fully close, creating unstable engagement zones where fighting intensified without decisive resolution. In these zones, combat became fragmented and localized. Rather than a single unified battlefront, the engagement broke into multiple pressure points. Each point influenced adjacent formations, creating cascading effects across the battlefield. Mardonius, recognizing the need for decisive breakthrough, concentrated his forces against what appeared to be the weakest segment of the Greek line. This decision reflected both strategic necessity and interpretation of battlefield signals. But the perception of weakness was shaped by incomplete information, a recurring feature of extended engagements in contested terrain. Greek commanders anticipated this concentration. Rather than collapsing under pressure, they reinforced targeted sectors while maintaining overall formation integrity. This adaptive response prevented localized breaches from becoming systemic failure. As the engagement intensified, the Persian command structure became increasingly dependent on rapid decision cycles. This reduced deliberation time, but increased the risk of misalignment between units. Speed replaced coordination, and pressure replaced structure. The Greeks, by contrast, maintained slower but more stable decision rhythms. Their advantage was not mobility or numbers, but consistency of response under stress. This contrast became decisive as the battle expanded. At a critical moment, Persian forces achieved temporary penetration into Greek defensive alignment. However, this breach did not propagate into collapse. Instead, it became a concentrated zone of sustained combat, where neither side could fully dislodge the other. This stabilization of contact zones marked the transition from maneuver warfare to decisive engagement. The battlefield was no longer defined by movement. It was defined by endurance within fixed confrontation points. And at this stage, Mardonius himself entered the thick of the fighting, reinforcing the commitment of his forces at the tactical level. This act reflected the narrowing of strategic options. Command and combat were no longer separate layers of decision-making. The war at Plataea had now reached its final operational phase, and resolution was no longer a question of movement. It was a question of collapse. The engagement at Plataea no longer resembled a campaign of maneuver. It had fully transformed into sustained, attritional collision between two systems that could no longer disengage cleanly. What began as strategic positioning had compressed into localized points of collapse and resistance across the battlefield. And within that compression, the Persian army under Mardonius entered its most decisive phase. The concentration of Persian pressure against Greek formations under Spartan command, led by Pausanias, intensified the strain on both sides. Greek lines held, but not without deformation. Shields locked, ranks tightened, and successive waves of impact forced continuous adjustment rather than advance or retreat. The structure of Greek resistance remained anchored in cohesion. Even when segments of the line absorbed severe pressure, they did not fragment. This discipline prevented the kind of cascading collapse that Persian command had expected from earlier phases of the war. The destruction of Athens' sacred center at the Acropolis of Athens had already eliminated any strategic possibility of psychological withdrawal. What remained was physical endurance. Persian forces, by contrast, operated under increasing strain of coordination. The earlier advantages of mobility and numerical flexibility were reduced in effectiveness as the battlefield narrowed into fixed contact zones. Cavalry units, once critical for disruption, found limited space to maneuver effectively. Infantry formations were required to sustain prolonged engagement without the relief of rotation or repositioning. Mardonius continued to direct operations from within proximity of the front line. This proximity reflected the collapse of separation between command and execution. Orders were no longer transmitted through extended hierarchy alone. They were reinforced through immediate presence. This increased urgency but reduced strategic abstraction. As fighting intensified, Persian assaults focused repeatedly on segments of the Greek line that showed signs of compression under sustained pressure. These targeted efforts created localized moments of instability, but each was met with rapid reinforcement from adjacent Greek units. The result was a pattern of oscillating pressure rather than breakthrough. Within this pattern, the Persian command attempted to leverage cumulative fatigue. The assumption was that continuous engagement would eventually erode Greek cohesion. However, the Greeks countered this through controlled rotation within their formations, maintaining structural continuity even under prolonged strain. At this stage, the battlefield had become a system of interlocking stress points. No single engagement determined outcome. Instead, multiple simultaneous pressures interacted across the front. The complexity of this interaction made rapid strategic correction difficult for Persian command, especially as communication delays increased under battlefield conditions. The psychological dimension of the conflict also intensified. Persian forces, aware of the extended duration of the campaign far from imperial center, faced mounting pressure to achieve decisive outcome. The absence of Xerxes, who had withdrawn after the Battle of Salamis, remained a structural factor in command responsibility. Mardonius carried full accountability for resolution without imperial intervention. Greek forces, in contrast, operated under a different psychological structure. The memory of Athens' destruction remained a stabilizing reference point. It did not generate impulsive aggression, but it eliminated uncertainty about stakes. The war was no longer about territorial dispute alone. It was about preventing irreversible cultural and civic erasure. As engagement continued, Persian forces attempted a concentrated push designed to fracture the center of the Greek line. This maneuver required synchronization across multiple contingents. Initial momentum was achieved, and for a brief period, Greek formations were compressed under severe pressure. However, the expected collapse did not occur. Instead, Greek units absorbed the impact and redistributed pressure laterally across adjacent formations. This prevented central rupture and transformed the Persian advance into a stalled penetration zone rather than a breakthrough. Once stalled, Persian forces became increasingly exposed to counterpressure. Greek units, maintaining formation integrity, applied controlled resistance that gradually stabilized the front. The battlefield shifted from Persian-driven escalation to mutual exhaustion within fixed engagement zones. It was within this stabilized but violent equilibrium that Mardonius made his final operational commitment. Recognizing that partial engagement would not produce decisive outcome, he intensified pressure across multiple sectors simultaneously. This was an attempt to overload Greek defensive capacity through distributed force application. The result, however, was dispersion of Persian coordination. Instead of achieving concentrated breakthrough, forces became engaged across wider fronts without decisive concentration. The advantage of mass was diluted by fragmentation of effort. At this point, command effectiveness became as important as numerical strength. Greek cohesion allowed for predictable reinforcement patterns. Persian dispersion reduced the effectiveness of localized superiority. Mardonius himself was drawn deeper into the engagement as battlefield conditions deteriorated. His presence at critical points reflected the collapsing distance between leadership and combat reality. Strategic planning was no longer separate from immediate survival conditions. The battle had now reached a stage where structural endurance determined outcome more than tactical innovation. Each side continued to operate within the limits of its formation logic, but only one maintained sufficient cohesion to convert endurance into stability. And as the pressure continued to accumulate, the system approached the point where localized Persian overextension would no longer be recoverable. The final phase of the confrontation was now forming within the friction of sustained contact. By this stage of the battle, Plataea was no longer a contest of strategy in the traditional sense. It had become a structural failure test for two armies operating beyond optimal conditions of command, coordination, and supply. And the Persian force under Mardonius was approaching the limits of recoverable cohesion. The sustained engagement against Greek forces commanded by Pausanias had already eliminated the possibility of clean disengagement. What remained was continuous pressure across fragmented fronts, where each localized success or failure influenced adjacent sectors without producing decisive rupture. Persian tactical doctrine, which had relied heavily on coordinated mobility and the shock effect of cavalry support, was increasingly constrained by terrain saturation and formation compression. Cavalry units, once decisive in earlier phases of the campaign, found themselves limited to peripheral roles or short-range disruption attempts that could not fully develop into breakthroughs. Greek formations, anchored in disciplined infantry cohesion, maintained structural resistance even under sustained pressure. This resistance was not static. It was adaptive within fixed boundaries. Units shifted weight laterally, reinforced weak points, and prevented localized penetrations from expanding into systemic collapse. At the center of Persian operations, Mardonius continued to push for decisive rupture. His strategy had evolved from controlled pressure to concentrated force application. He attempted repeated penetrative assaults on sectors perceived as vulnerable, seeking a single point where Greek cohesion might fail. However, battlefield perception in prolonged engagements is inherently unstable. What appeared as vulnerability often proved to be temporary compression rather than structural weakness. Greek units absorbed pressure, stabilized, and then redistributed it across adjacent formations. The cumulative effect of this dynamic was exhaustion without resolution. Persian forces expended energy across multiple engagement points without achieving sustained penetration. Greek forces endured pressure but maintained continuity. At this stage, logistical strain began to manifest more clearly within the Persian camp. Extended duration of engagement reduced the effectiveness of supply reinforcement. Even small disruptions in provisioning had amplified effects under conditions of continuous combat readiness. The army was not collapsing, but its operational flexibility was narrowing. Greek forces, while also under strain, benefited from shorter internal lines of communication and more stable supply access through allied territories. This allowed for more predictable reinforcement cycles, even under sustained pressure. The psychological condition of both sides reflected this divergence. Persian morale became increasingly dependent on immediate tactical success, as prolonged uncertainty eroded confidence in eventual breakthrough. Greek morale, in contrast, was stabilized by the absence of alternative outcomes. The destruction of Athens' sacred core at the Acropolis of Athens had already eliminated the possibility of partial reconciliation or negotiated settlement. In this environment, Mardonius intensified personal involvement in frontline coordination. His presence at critical sectors was not symbolic alone, it was operational. He attempted to correct fragmentation in real time, reinforcing units where pressure threatened structural integrity. But this proximity also reflected the diminishing separation between command authority and battlefield constraint. As fighting continued, Persian forces executed another concentrated effort aimed at breaking Greek center cohesion. Initial momentum created localized compression of Greek lines. For a brief period, it appeared that structural failure might occur under sustained pressure. However, Greek reinforcement patterns activated rapidly. Adjacent units absorbed redistributed pressure, preventing central rupture. This response transformed what could have been breakthrough into another contained engagement zone. At this point, the battle began to transition into its final structural phase. Persian forces, having committed significant portions of their operational flexibility, found it increasingly difficult to generate new forms of tactical variation. Repetition replaced adaptation. Pressure replaced innovation. Greek forces, while also engaged continuously, maintained a more stable internal rhythm of reinforcement and stabilization. This allowed them to sustain cohesion even as individual segments experienced severe stress. The battlefield itself had now become segmented into multiple interlocking zones of attrition. No single front determined outcome. Instead, the interaction between zones created a cumulative effect that gradually favored the side with greater structural stability. Mardonius recognized that partial engagement was no longer sufficient. The battle required either decisive breakthrough or controlled withdrawal. Yet withdrawal under these conditions carried severe risk, as it would expose retreating forces to disruption and fragmentation. Therefore, he committed further to engagement, intensifying pressure across multiple sectors simultaneously. This decision reflected both strategic necessity and narrowing options. The Persian army was now operating within a constrained decision space where each choice carried irreversible consequences. Greek commanders, observing the distribution of Persian pressure, adjusted formation density to absorb and redirect attacks. This adaptability prevented localized superiority from translating into systemic advantage for Persian forces. As this phase continued, fatigue became a defining factor. Not exhaustion in a single moment, but cumulative strain across repeated cycles of engagement. Formation integrity became increasingly dependent on discipline rather than physical capacity alone. The battle had now reached a point where structural endurance outweighed tactical initiative. Each side remained active, but only one maintained sufficient coherence to convert endurance into controlled stability under pressure. And within this narrowing field of possibility, the conditions for final resolution were fully formed. By the time the final phase of the battle unfolded at Plataea, the confrontation had already ceased to be a contest of maneuver and had become a test of structural endurance under irreversible commitment. Every formation had been shaped, compressed, and reformed through repeated cycles of pressure, until neither side retained the flexibility that had defined the earlier stages of the campaign. And at the center of this exhausted equilibrium stood the Persian command under Mardonius, now fully exposed to the consequences of extended engagement. The Greek forces under Pausanias held their positions with a discipline that had been refined through every preceding phase of the war. Their cohesion was no longer simply tactical. It had become structural identity. The memory of Athens' destruction, particularly the burning of its sacred core at the Acropolis of Athens, remained embedded not as a motivating surge, but as a permanent boundary of what could not be allowed to stand. Persian forces, despite sustained effort and numerical strength, were now operating within a reduced strategic envelope. Their earlier advantages in mobility, cavalry coordination, and multi-ethnic force integration had been progressively constrained by terrain saturation, communication strain, and prolonged exposure to continuous combat conditions. What had once been an army capable of wide operational flexibility was now forced into increasingly rigid engagement patterns. At this stage, Mardonius committed fully to a concentrated assault designed to break Greek cohesion at a decisive point. The objective was no longer gradual erosion, but immediate rupture. He concentrated elite units and coordinated multiple formations in a synchronized push against the Greek center, attempting to overwhelm stability through mass pressure. The initial impact of this assault created significant compression within the Greek lines. Shields locked under strain, ranks tightened beyond normal spacing, and localized segments of the formation absorbed intense pressure. For a brief moment, the battlefield appeared to shift toward Persian advantage. But the structural resilience of the Greek formation did not fail. Instead, it adapted. Pressure was redistributed laterally across adjacent units, preventing any single point from collapsing. Reinforcement cycles activated rapidly, and gaps were stabilized before they could expand. The effect was not reversal, but containment. As Persian forces continued to press forward, their own internal coordination began to degrade under the intensity of simultaneous engagement across multiple sectors. Units committed to the central assault became partially isolated from supporting formations. This created fragmentation within the attacking structure itself, reducing the effectiveness of concentrated force. Greek commanders, recognizing this fragmentation, maintained disciplined resistance rather than pursuing immediate counteroffensive expansion. Their strategy remained consistent: preserve cohesion, absorb pressure, and prevent overextension. In doing so, they allowed Persian forces to expend momentum without achieving structural breakthrough. Within this narrowing engagement space, Mardonius himself moved closer to the center of combat operations. His presence at critical points reflected the collapsing separation between command authority and battlefield necessity. Orders were no longer distant directives. They were immediate interventions within unfolding combat conditions. As pressure intensified, Persian formations began to lose synchronization between adjacent units. Some contingents advanced while others stalled, creating uneven engagement fronts. These discontinuities reduced the overall effectiveness of the assault and increased exposure of forward elements to counterpressure. Greek forces exploited these structural inconsistencies not through pursuit, but through stabilization. By maintaining formation integrity and resisting fragmentation, they converted Persian overextension into sustained attritional disadvantage. The battlefield began to lock into a pattern where Persian momentum repeatedly stalled before achieving decisive penetration. At a critical point in the engagement, Mardonius was drawn into the most intense sector of combat. Historical accounts converge on the fact that he engaged directly at close range as the situation deteriorated. His fall within the battle marked not merely the loss of a commander, but the collapse of coordinated Persian operational leadership on the field. Following this moment, Persian cohesion weakened rapidly. Without centralized command presence to stabilize fragmented units, the structure of the assault began to disintegrate. Units that had been committed to breakthrough attempts found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to sustain coordinated pressure. Greek forces, maintaining formation discipline, transitioned from pure defense into controlled pressure application. This did not immediately transform the battle into pursuit, but it shifted the structural balance. Persian forces, now lacking unified coordination, began to experience localized withdrawals